Hi, Roger Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to this, our election 2025 coverage. We are at day 5. I'm joined by Sean Speer, my co-founder and editor at large. I don't know about you, Sean, but I feel like a month has passed. We got, 3 more weeks of this. Wow.
Yeah, you can imagine how people are feeling in the war rooms. It is an exhausting experience. I had the privilege of working on the 2011 campaign and the 2015 campaign. Um, One of the most intense periods of my life, and so I've enjoyed watching it from afar, Roger, over the past week, as opposed to being in the mix.
Yeah, not too far though. Let's take a quick look here at where the leaders are today. Mark Carney is going to be in Ottawa taking a teleconference with the premiers to respond to Donald Trump's auto tariffs, to, I guess, begin to think that through. What are we going to do? Will we retaliate or not? And then he'll have some other avails later in the day. Pierre Poilievre is holding a press conference in Nanaimo, British Columbia. He's staying out west right now. He'll be giving that press conference at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. And then Jagmeet Singh is in Toronto. He's got a 10 a.m. announcement on the cards. We'll see what that's about. Toronto, absolutely key to the NDP if they want to have any hope here of rebuilding from the low single digits. Sean, I want to talk to you about some breaking news this morning. There are reports in the media that Mark Carney's PhD thesis seems to have lifted quotes content from other academic sources. This was a dissertation written, I guess, almost 30 odd years ago. What's your sense? Does this matter? Obviously, plagiarism is a serious thing. We saw that big resignation in the midst of another kind of political moment in the United States. The president of Harvard having to step down, and generally in the last while, I think plagiarism has taken on more emphasis in just people's sense of what the public discourse and especially in academia, the importance of facts and making sure those facts are your own.
Yeah, congratulations to our friends at the National Post. This is a big scoop, a good bit of journalism where they went in and analyzed carefully Mr. Carney's PhD dissertation, and as you say, found several instances, I think 10, where at best you could say sources were improperly referenced or lacked reference, and or at worst represented, for all intents and purposes, plagiarism. I don't know, Rudyard, if it's going to have a major effect on the campaign, but I will say this. I mentioned that I've been involved in national campaigns before. I'm drawing a bit on that experience. These types of stories are destabilizing. I think on Monday we talked about how, Rudyard, in a 36-day campaign, you want to win more days than you lose. On a day like this, they have a message that they want to advance around Mark Carney being the prime minister, being the best leader to advance and protect Canadian interests vis-a-vis the United States. That's why, of course, he's come off the campaign trail and is hosting this session with the premiers. And let me tell you, when that story hit this morning, all of their plans were disrupted, shaken up, and now they'll be on the defensive for the day. And so, in that sense, even if it doesn't have long-term effects, that would have shot right through the Liberal war room today, the Liberal campaign, and put them on the defensive. And the question, I think, for the Conservatives is this a one-day story, or does it become a multi-day story? And that will depend in part on whether journalists find other instances of plagiarism in Mr. Carney's large record.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to bring Daryl Bricker on in a moment to give us a sense of where the polls are at. But just to ask a follow-up question, Sean, because you've been in these campaigns. I've not. I mean, to what extent do you think the Post actually found this story? Like, was this, to me, it strikes me as like opposition research that maybe the Conservatives have done for months on Mark Carney, and something was leaked to a friendly media outlet. Isn't that the more likely reason why this is in the press today?
Yeah, that's probably right. What struck me, Rudyard, in reading it, particularly because a lot of the instances where sentences or paragraphs were taken from others' work and not properly attributed, is what those people thought. There's a couple of scholars in particular who seem to have whose work seems to have been the ones that Carney drew from. I wonder what they've thought over the past 30 years, and what they're thinking today, that he's being outed for essentially lifting their work. I think that's another angle here. Do we start to see academics or others come out and raise concerns about either his dissertation or other work he's done? But I guess just at a big picture level, Mark Carney is selling competence. He's selling capability, and a story like this, chips away at that a bit. I don't think it's ultimately decisive, but as I say, they're having a bad day today in the liberal worm, and they were intending to have a good one.
Yeah. We're going to bring Daryl Brecker into this show. We've got him on audio right now. He's having some camera problems, but let's get him in here to give us a sense, Daryl, of the latest, what you're seeing as the polls, and maybe if you could react, Daryl, to this leak, talking about a lot of leaks this week from the Ontario PC Conservatives, who are kind of leaking their internal polling in Ontario, showing a very significant lead for the Liberals over the Conservatives in this province.
Well, I would say, Richard, that first of all, we need to, talk about the true thing that's going on in this campaign, and that's the Liberals, in spite of what Sean's talking about right now, have had about as good a start as anybody could have. I mean, it's been a fantastic launch for the Liberal campaign. They now have a clear lead, at least in our polling, although it seems to have stalled a little bit this week, and I don't know if that's because they've reached a peak or they're waiting to go to a new level. And it's a pretty significant lead and could potentially lead to a Liberal majority. The NDP vote has collapsed. I mean, that's pretty clear. They're, depending on the poll you look at, that's, higher single digits or lower single digits, but you're showing a picture of Jagmeet Singh right now pointing at NDP. It should be a much smaller logo, I think, given what we're seeing in terms of his electoral performance. And everything that's leadership related, Carney is very well ahead of Poilievre. And the only things that Pierre Poilievre is leading on in terms of leadership right now, when we test that, are all things you actually don't want to be leading on. Things like having a hidden agenda, not being mature enough for the job, that kind of thing. So that's disquieting. On Trump and trade, Carney and the Liberals own it. There's no denying that. I mean, every question that we ask about that, it's very clear. And the Trump tariffs have now become a big issue. And although, interestingly enough, it's not the biggest. So when you go and you actually take a look at the polls, what people say is the biggest issue is cost of living. But I don't know that those two issues are kind of the same issue, because the effect of the Trump tariffs is going to be on people's cost of living, or Canadians' cost of living. So I would say that, you couldn't have had a better week. Now, maybe they've stumbled a little bit on the plagiarism thing, and I know as academics we're really offended by that. I don't know. I don't know that average Canadians are. But let me take just a minute to talk a bit about some of the criticism of the Tory campaign that took place from a stage here in Toronto this week. I think that the person who was the critic was right about an awful lot. Let's just start from there. He's 100% right about the need for the Conservative campaign to do a better job of responding to the Trump critique. I don't think there's any doubt about that. He's right about campaigning against Trudeau and the Liberal Party's record and some of the things that are a bit more tangential that tend to bother people who are more core Conservative voters. Really is kind of falling on deaf ears right now, because you're not going to win with the core. You have to expand beyond the core. He's also right that Pierre Poilievre is not a likable politician, but that's nothing new. I mean, that's been from the first day. Pierre Poilievre's negatives have been pretty high. I think where he's less right is comparing the Ontario campaign and the very successful campaign that they ran to what the federal Conservatives are confronting right now. It's very different. And it's very different for a few reasons. First, Ford was an incumbent, and he was facing two very weak opposition leaders.
Right.
Pierre Poilievre is an opposition leader facing a very strong incumbent, but new incumbent that's really interesting to Canadians right now, particularly at this time. Bonnie Crombie and Merritt Stiles were not that. So Doug Ford wasn't facing anything that looked like that. And the Captain Canada theme is a lot easier to pull off if you're a sitting premier. I mean, the leader of the opposition isn't going to fly off to Washington and demand meetings and say, I'm going to shut off power and do sorts of other things. It just doesn't land the same way. So it's a much easier position to campaign from. The other thing was that Polyev wasn't is up against Mark Carney, as I said before, very different, but also that Ford is very well known to the electorate. In fact, he has a lot of shortcomings when you ask people on surveys what you think of Doug Ford, but they kind of have built them in and they've already forgiven them. He's really well known to Ontarians and he's an acceptable premier. Pierre Poilievre, in many ways, is just introducing himself to the Ontario public. So it's a different situation that they find themselves in, and they're prepared to forgive Doug Ford's downsides, and we saw that repeatedly during the campaign. But while the analysis is essentially right, and I don't want to be critical of the person who's making these comments because he's right about an awful lot of it, it's kind of banal. It's kind of like, so what? I remember a client once when I was went into a meeting and gave a very long impassioned presentation about why things were going wrong. And this person was Michael Wilson. And it was interesting because I was presenting on the NAFTA. I was a very young pollster, and I was standing in this darkened room with a PowerPoint projector, and not even PowerPoint. It was overhead slides. And I was putting them up, and I was yammering, and on, why everything was going so bad, so bad, so bad, so bad, so bad. And I got to the end of it, and he raised the question that everybody should raise whenever they hear a critique. Okay, smartass, what do I do now? So I know everything that's wrong, but okay. And by the way, I'm not calling the person who was saying this a smartass, but this was directed at me.
Yeah.
And it raises the ultimate question. Okay, so you've made all of these observations. So what do you do now?
Mm-hmm.
It's not as easy as replicating the progressive conservative campaign in Ontario.
No,
it's a
right.
very different context.
Different
players. Given this
Yeah.
context, if you were handed this context, what would you do different?
Yeah. Well, Sean,
and
let's bring the question to you. What would you do differently?
What else?
As Daryl said, the table is set. You've got this candidate. You have a reality that next week is going to be all about tariffs. I mean, it's going to dominate everything in the news cycle in the lead up to April 2nd and the days after.
Yeah. So the easy part is to say, okay, you really need to be strong on tariffs. But as I think I've said on this show before, and I'll repeat again, it's like that old Steve Martin joke. How do you become a millionaire and pay no taxes? First, get $1 million.
Yeah.
It's like, okay. So I need to be strong on tariffs. Okay. So maybe I need something new, but the context doesn't change for me. So the Poilievre campaign simply can't take the Ford campaign and photocopy it and apply it to what they're going through, because the context is very different. And just as if the Ford campaign had been facing what Pierre Poilievre and his campaign is facing, they would have been in a very similar sort of circumstance in Ontario.
Great.
Yeah,
Sean, let me come to you.
Ton of insight there, Daryl. You covered a lot of ground. I'll resist the temptation to jump in on a bunch of different topics, including your view that the Liberals have had a great start to the campaign. Why don't we seize on this question, which was really at the heart of the election so far, which is which party is best positioned on the tariff issue. Help our audience understand why Canadians have come to this view that Mark Carney is self-evidently better than Pierre Poilievre on tariffs, because I think understanding the cause of that intuition is crucial for the if the Conservatives are to change things. They need to understand why Canadians are of that view. It seems to me, in a lot of ways, it comes down to vibes more than anything else.
Well, I think it's also what they know about both leaders. So Pierre Poilievre, I think, did a brilliant job positioning himself to run against Justin Trudeau. So what they know about him is who's going to get rid of the carbon tax, who's going to, deal with your taxes better, who's going to do all of those things which sound very 2024. They know all of those things, and that's his profile. He never really spent any of the last 2 years preparing himself on these big macroeconomic questions. He's very much a microeconomic kind of guy. It was all about how this fits into your own personal life and the rest of it. So he established himself as that. He established himself very much as an agent of change, of disruption, and he did a great job of it. Now all of a sudden this new issue has come onto the table, and two people are starting off as at best equivalents. So they've got these two leaders, one who's clearly identified with something else, and one who isn't really identified with anything, but seems to have the presentation and the pedigree, at least in the limited amount that people know, that says he's not about the agenda that Per Poilievre's talking about. He's about this other thing. So that's why he's in a position of strength on it. They've done as good a job as anybody could do, identifying that key issue and making sure that they put a person in charge that is able to do this. If it was Justin Trudeau, Pierre Poilievre would still be double digits ahead.
You mentioned that notwithstanding the focus on Trump and tariffs, your polling continues to find cost of living issues looming large with the Canadian population. It prompts the question, should the Conservatives essentially cede the ground on the tariff issue and double down on the cost of living one, which seems to be what's behind the party's strategy so far in this campaign?
I would say that when you see the degree of difference, which in Ontario, that the presentation absolutely is 100% right about, the degree of difference between where Carney and the Liberals sit on tariffs and dealing with Donald Trump is the question. I don't think that anybody knows enough about tariffs. Tariffs are just part of Donald Trump. It's
sure.
Along with the hair and the orange is tariffs, and so people see it all as one package. But so the Liberals are way ahead on that, like really far ahead. But on the issue of cost of living, which is number one, the Conservatives and Liberals are tied.
Interesting.
Okay, Darryl,
So
we're going to say goodbye to you there. Always appreciate the deep dives that you give us. It's such a illuminating time to spend with you as we unpack what has been a kind of consequential first week of the campaign.
Thanks a lot.
Sean, fascinating stuff from Darryl there. And again, it's interesting to note that the competitiveness is still there on the affordability issue. But boy, next week, the Conservatives are going to get forced off that. They're going to get pushed off that. And what I worry about, because we also like to talk about policy here at the Hub, is these parties could quickly get into a bidding war in terms of who's going to be tougher on Trump. Retaliatory tariffs, if you want to be honest about it, are kind of as dumb as a bag of hammers, and we could be reaching into a bag, pull out a lot of hammers next week, Sean.
Yeah, I agree, Roger. And just even more generally about the political incentives that the different parties are facing in the face of Trump's provocations. I saw a well-regarded American commentator say in response to Carney's speech yesterday, in which he asserted that the Canada-U.S. relationship, at least as we understand it, is over. This American commentator posted, quote, "I cannot emphasize enough what a remarkable thing it is for any Canadian prime minister, let alone one who's a quintessential member of the country's centrist elite, to talk like this," unquote. And it seems to me that misses the point. The incentives are, this isn't a major insight on the part of Carney. The incentives are tilted in favor of him communicating that way. I mean, to go to Darryl's point, that in a way is why they're outperforming the Conservatives on this issue, because they've taken this maximalist position. Yeah. And I think the Conservatives in the coming days are going to be forced into to match them. Yeah. And our politics are going to be off in the direction of this bidding war over who can be more antagonistic to the American administration, and as you say, who's prepared to spend more money showering it on industries and households and others.
Well, Sean, perfect segue to our next guest, which is the Hub's editor-in-chief for business and economics, Theo Argyris, who had a terrific column today in the Hub talking, Theo, about exactly this, the extent to which tariffs and countervailing duties and the revenues that are going to flow off this are now, Theo, in your view, becoming increasingly kind of hardwired into what's been a pretty big spending bonanza this week, tax expenditures, announcements from both parties. So why don't you unpack your core argument for our audience?
Yeah, next week we're going to get. Good morning, guys. Next week we're going to get obviously some important announcements from the Trump administration on tariffs. On multiple fronts. What he's going to do with the existing tariffs that exist that he already has imposed on Canada, and whether he's going to impose new ones. And that will probably trigger, more formally a response from the Canadian government, which, as I note in the story, but also, I mean, I've seen on social media how the Canadian government has these advertisements in the U.S. on how tariff is a tax and trying to
Yeah.
kind of illustrate, underscore
Tax
how
here in Canada
the
too.
the U.S. tariffs are imposing a tax on Americans. Well, the response will essentially be that, which is quite an extraordinary thing to do, which is to impose taxes on households mid election campaign. I don't know if we've ever been in that situation before. And my point in the article essentially is that there are plenty of risks associated with relying too much on tariffs. And Sean talked about the political incentives, but we don't want to be the political incentives of kind of having a very aggressive pushback vis-a-vis Trump. My concern is that we will also have fiscal incentives to push back aggressively on Trump. And there will be this kind of weird situation where the harder they push in terms of actual concrete retaliatory tariffs, the more they'll have in their campaign war chest. And that poses a number of risks. One is the fact that the truth is we don't really know what our tariff regime will look like in, let's say, 5, 6, 7 months, because not only is Trump kind of notoriously kind of willing to kind of move back on things that he does, reverse measures, but also we really haven't had a debate even in Canada on what retaliatory tariffs should look like, what the strategy here. I think it's been more emotional than really intellectual type of debate. So that's kind of the one thing. We don't really want to spend money that we don't really know we'll have in a few months from now.
Theo, I just want to bring Sean into this because Sean, there's something quite magical about tariffs, and Theo brings it up wonderfully in his piece. Is that it's a kind of way to tax people, but make them really excited about getting hit with a tax. It's wild, and I think it's part of the reason. It's part of the kind of genius, actually, of what Trump is doing, and he's increasingly linking these tariffs to generating revenue to pay for the big tax cuts that he wants to get through Congress. And now in a similar way, our parties are thinking, wow, we got billions of dollars here that are potentially flowing in. And I guess whenever they decide to release their costed campaign platforms, they're going to allocate that tariff money to, as Theo said, paper up the cracks here on what would be a bonanza of government spending funded in effect by a tax hike.
Yeah. Roger, we're so glad to have Theo on the team, and his piece today is precisely the reason why. We've been worried for some time, Roger, that the Canadian government, that Canadian politicians weren't merely thinking about retaliatory tariffs through the lens of trade policy, that they couldn't resist the temptation to also see retaliatory tariffs as part of their fiscal policy. Just in this past week alone, we've seen major expenditures announced by the different parties. Theo estimates that the conservative tax cut, for instance, represents something north of $14 billion in foregone revenue. On the other hand, the two major parties have also nodded in the direction of a balanced budget. And so it prompts the question, how do you hold all these things together? And I worry, as Theo said in his piece today, the answer is going to be retaliatory tariffs. The problem, of course, is by definition, the purpose of retaliatory tariffs isn't to generate revenue. It's to induce a settlement with the United States so we can get back to relatively free access to the American market. And so you worry if it becomes the foundation of the next government's fiscal plans if it pushes against the interests of the country, which are ultimately to get back to tariff-free trade. I think this is an important contribution to the public policy debate from Theo, and I hope that people are paying close attention to it, because, as you say, whenever these costed platforms come out, if at the bottom, before you get the final budgetary balance, there's a significant tariff line, really what's going on here.
Yeah.
Come on, and we're talking about a lot of money. Just the proposed $155 billion worth of tariffs that have already been proposed, which are not dollar for dollar, could be raising as much as $30 billion annually or more in additional revenue.
That's like, just to put that in perspective, Roger, that's something like the equivalent of 3 percentage points on the GST. That's in the grand scheme of things, that's real revenue for the government of Canada.
But Theo, I mean, at a very moment where we're going to have an economic shock, potential job losses, I just don't understand this, because wouldn't economic policies be there to lower taxes, whether delivered through the income tax system or through sales taxes or through tariffs, because you want the economy to try to chug along to the best it can, because you're not, in a sense, placing a burden on especially on the consumer, which is really important in the Canadian economy.
Yeah, which is why we actually really do need to have a debate in this country about, what is the best way to respond. And I don't know if we're going to have it in the middle of an election campaign, but there's a number of reasons why you could argue that you need retaliatory tariffs. One is deterrence. Hoping maybe that the Americans have a lower tolerance of economic pain for these sorts of trade wars, because we know we're not going to win a trade war with the U.S., but maybe they have a lower tolerance for it. Or it could be to raise tariff walls around Canada. You had Mark Carney yesterday kind of, articulating in a way almost like a very nationalistic approach. Maybe that's kind of mimicking the American kind of rationale, or it is to raise revenue. But let's have an honest debate about what we're doing. And if it is about raising revenue, there are actually much better ways to raise revenue than tariffs, because the truth is tariffs are incredibly regressive taxation.
Except politically, though, right? Theo, which is Rudyard's point. Like, one of the reasons the Harper's reduction of the GST had so much political salience was because of its visibility, right, Rudyard? Every time someone buys something, they can see the sales tax they're paying. Incidentally, it's the same. One of the reasons the carbon tax has been so unpopular. From the matter of politics, what makes tariffs an attractive source of revenue is not just that you can gussy them up in the name of patriotism, as you said, is that they are highly invisible. How they go through the price system is unclear. And so in hindsight, we should have thought of this, that the trade war caused by Trump is handing Canadian politicians across all parties, it must be said, this revenue source to essentially hold their fiscal plans together that no one quite understands, no one quite knows who's paying what, but that is, as Theo says, could, at least in the short term, generate significant revenue windfalls for the government of Canada.
Theo, let's give you the last word in this section. What is your bet as to how this plays out? Knowing how Ottawa works, and after an election, do you think there's an opportunity for cooler heads to prevail here and potentially retaliatory tariffs to come off? Because precisely they are a tax on us. I mean, they're just making the inflationary effects of tariffs worse.
Yeah. Interestingly, you had Ian Bremmer from Eurasia Group yesterday put out a note predicting that the next Canadian government will fold quietly, he said, after the election, which just kind of reflects really an economic reality that we have been trading with the Americans for a very, very long time. We haven't really been very successful of trading with anyone else. The pain of a trade war or trade walls, tariff walls, is going to be very, very. It's going to be very large kind of economic impact, primarily in Eastern Canada, And even we're in the middle of an election campaign now, and national sentiment is extremely elevated. But when the bills come,
Yes.
and we have to think about kind of how much we really want to sacrifice, maybe cooler heads will prevail.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Theo. I'm just so proud of the team here. Look at this, the three amigos.
Yeah.
What Theo? You're an economic. What free trade conference was that? The three or four amigos? I forget. I was always the three, wasn't it?
Oh, the Three Amigos. It was the Canada, U.S., Mexico kind of summit
Yeah.
that I'm not sure when they
Boy,
ended those, but
those seem like different days, eh? I think it was George, the original Bush in a sombrero with
Yes.
whoever it was. It wasn't Vicente Fox. I'll have to remember. Look, guys, thank you so much. And Theo, thanks for the great reporting. Urge viewers and listeners to check it out right now at the Hub. You get Theo Argytas exclusively at the Hub for all of our best economics and business insight. Sean, I'm going to say goodbye and sayonara for this edition of Election 2025. Friday, we made it through the week.
Yes,
We'll kick
yes,
it all off
yes.
again on Monday mornings at 10 a.m. So we'll say goodbye to Theo now. We'll say goodbye to our audio listeners. But if you want to stick around on the live stream for a couple more minutes, Sean and I will be taking questions from the live chat. So we'll say that goodbye now. Bye-bye.